Hi, everyone. Looks like somebody already jumped in to ask a question. So we got one book claimed. While I'm talking, please feel free to keep drawing on your zine. If you showed up a little bit late, we're doing a little drawing project as just for fun, where I asked everyone to draw an ode basically to an everyday object whose design you love. So mine is about a lime squeezer. Even brought my own lime squeezer. Yours can be about whatever you want. After I talk, we'll share what we made in breakout rooms. So feel free to keep drawing and just see what happens. I think it's really powerful to put pen to paper. And a lot of people have some anxiety around writing and drawing. And I think it's just important to like make space to draw and see what comes out of your brain. So please keep drawing while I'm talking. I'm gonna share my screen and do a little presentation about comics journalism. Yeah, so I'm a comics journalist. Comics journalism is the act of documenting the world through comics. So a combination of writing and text. And it can mean drawing about your own life and your own experiences. It can also mean doing reported stories where you go and talk to people out in the world and talk about their stories. I'm going to be talking today about how comics journalism can challenge dominant narratives. So a dominant narrative is like a story that's really accepted in society. It's a story that has a lot of power and that you hear often. It's kind of like the mainstream story that's told in society about a person, a place, a group of people. That's the dominant narrative. And I think comics, and especially comics journalism, really has a power to subvert that kind of storytelling, to tell new stories and different stories on topics. So I'm going to be talking about that today. And I'm going to be talking about my work writing this book about Guantanamo Bay prison. So it's going to get a little heavy, just a heads up. It's a tough topic. So these days, I make a lot of comics about my own life. I consider this a form of comics journalism, but it's fun. You know, it's documenting what I see around in the world and capturing those moments. So here's an example. Here's a little comic I drew just about me and my partner talking. And it says, it's me talking, and I said, I don't know, 2 new pairs of sweatpants? Is this too extravagant? And he says, well, you know me, I'm a hedonist. Really? I never think of you as a hedonist. I only do what feels good. That's why I don't do anything. Nothing feels good. This was just, I thought it was really funny. So I try and capture these kind of moments when they come along. That's something that feels special and worth documenting. And then I also try and capture other things that feel, you know, important in society. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of process of making a drawing. This is from last September, this photo. Anyone who was here in Portland definitely remembers these really dark days of the sun being blotted out by smoke. And I wanted to draw a comic capturing how I felt about the smoke covering the city. So what I do is, for making my comics that are reported stories like this one, is I take reference photos. This is me driving while wearing a respirator. And then in using the program Procreate on an iPad, I go over that photo and what I call pencils, and then color it. This is also digital, although it looks like a watercolor. It's just a brush and Procreate. Then I add text. So the final comic is that combination of image and text, which is definitely editorializing. It's from a specific angle. It's combining my thoughts with an image that I wanted to capture. So I can use this kind of style to report on all kinds of things. And, you know, I come from a background of more traditional journalism, working in print media. And from that school of journalism, they say that you should be objective. Basically, like the reporter doesn't have a voice in the story. You're just presenting the facts, just the facts, ma'am. I don't really agree with that mindset, because every reporter brings their own experiences, their own biases, their own background to the story that they're reporting on. So even if you're trying to be completely neutral and objective, you're still shaped by who you are, what you think is important, your race, your gender, your class, about what you think is the story here, who you talk to, who you listen to, what stories you bring out. In this way, I think that objectivity is a myth. And for me as a reporter, I try to be accurate and relevant and engaging, but also to recognize the lens that I'm bringing to the story and sort of how my perspective and experiences play into the story that I'm shaping. And comics journalism is all about doing that. This is a cool quote from a comics journalism professor at University of Oregon named Dr. Catherine Kelp-Stebbins. She says, objectivity is a position of privilege, that comics journalism is the closest thing there is to seeing it through someone else's eyes as presented by a human being who was there. I've been thinking about this quote a lot as I think about like, yeah, if you say that you're objective, you're actually saying, you know, I'm not involved here, but we're all involved. You know, some of us just pretend not to be. And with comics journalism, you're presenting something through your experience, you as the maker, and it's clearly made by hand. When you read a comic, you can see the line work and think, oh, this was made by a person. You can see the choices that they made as an artist and as a writer to tell the story. And in that way, I think that comics journalism challenges this more traditional idea of objectivity presented by other forms of journalism. Here's an example. So like last year, I went out to report on the big, huge Black Lives Matter protests here in Portland. And here's a photo from just one of the marches one night. To make this into a comic, what I do is I take reference photos like this, but then I edit them. So I edit down what I want to bring out as the artist to tell the story. In this case, I took out the background and I just selected a few people from the crowd to draw. And then what I don't change is what's written, any text on their signs, for example. I try to capture what people are wearing and kind of their body shape and how they're posed. But what comics is doing is capturing an emotional reality. So I can take that, I can play around with the colors to bring out a feeling of being there, even though it's not a photorealistic representation. And honestly, this is exactly what traditional journalists are doing. You know, if you're writing a print story or doing any form of traditional journalism, you're going out, you're experiencing something, and then you're editing that experience to make it into a narrative that then you're publishing. Comics journalism is doing a very similar thing, but we're doing it with visuals too, and making the hand of the creator very obvious here. It's clear, you know, I've taken this image and I've edited it to be, here's the story that I'm presenting. Here's another example. So here's the side-by-side, like, here's what the traditional photo, here's what the photo was, here's what my version of telling the story is. Here's another example from that protest. I saw this person watching the protest go by, and I just thought it was interesting to see like such a clear scene. It's clearly a restaurant worker from their outfit. And then they have this graffiti in the background. I don't know if you can see it, but it says ACAB and it has a ghost next to it. So to make this into a comic version, it looks like this. Derp. And you can see what elements I've brought out and what elements I've taken away. Just like a regular reporter does, there's elements you bring to the foreground, there's ones you put in the background, there's details you include and details you leave out. But I think with comics journalism, it's much more obvious that the artist is making those kinds of choices, that you're doing that kind of editing and writing as a journalist, because your hand is so clear in this final version. It's clear that it's coming from my lens as a creator. So this is the biggest comics journalism project I've worked on. It's called Guantanamo Voices. It's a book that came out in September. And it's a collection of 10 interviews that I did with people who have spent time at Guantanamo Bay prison in some capacity. And then those interviews are illustrated by 10 different artists. So each chapter is a different interview, and each interview has its own visual voice because it's illustrated by a different artist. And I wrote the book. So the dominant narrative around Guantanamo is told by the government. So, sometimes the dominant narrative is one that's created by media or by a specific powerful figure. In this case, the dominant narrative around the prison at Guantanamo is told by the government. It's that Guantanamo is a safe, humane, and legal detention facility that is necessary to save American lives. That's like the story the government has been telling since day one when this prison opened in 2002. Just a little background here. Guantanamo Bay is a prison located on a military base in Cuba, and a US military base, and it's opened in 2002. And it's been open for 20 years now. And today there's still 39 men there. And, the story, when I started reporting on Guantanamo, I realized that the actual story here is not super complicated. It's pretty simple. It's that the United States has imprisoned hundreds of Muslim men from around the world without trial for years. It sounds bad when you say it that way, and it is really bad. And this is the story that the government doesn't want to tell. They want to keep the focus on the safe, humane, legal detention facility that's necessary to save American lives, and not have us focus on this part of the story. So as a journalist, this is the story that I'm trying to bring out and help people understand. When I start the book with this quote from the Constitution and also from the Geneva Conventions, just because I wanted people to keep this in mind as they're reading the book. So these are two of the reasons why the prison violates American law and international law. It's been open for 20 years and we haven't had trials. So, you know, in the Geneva Conventions, it says, in no circumstance shall this confinement exceed 3 months, and we're going on 20 years. It's not good. You know, prisons are designed to be invisible in the United States. They're hard to get to. They're hard to access as a regular person. You can't just go into a prison and talk to people who are incarcerated there about their experiences. There's a bunch of hoops you have to jump through, and all of your interactions are monitored, as well as being in physically remote locations, meant to be like out of sight, out of mind. Don't think about those people who are incarcerated. There's no bigger example than this thing, Guantanamo, which is literally in a different country. You know, it's on a US military base on the southern side of Cuba. The only way to get there as a journalist is to go through the military. You have to apply to go, and they have to approve you, and then you have to like go on the little PR trip that's organized by the military. This is, you can see Guantanamo Bay on Google Maps. Google Maps helpfully notes that the prison is still open, which I think is funny because we've been trying to close it for about 20 years and Google's like, nope, still there, still open. Even on the military base itself, this is a Google Maps satellite view. It's removed from the rest of the base. So the military base itself, if anyone's ever been to one, it feels like a small American town. There's a bunch of stuff there. There's McDonald's, there's a Subway, there's several thousand people that work on the base, but the prison itself is removed from that. As you can see in this image, you have to have special access to get there. So even if you're somebody who's able to get to Guantanamo, you probably still haven't been able to see the prison. And nobody, like journalists, regular members of the public, is allowed to talk to people who are currently incarcerated in Guantanamo. That makes it really hard to report on because you can't talk to people who are actually in the prison, only former prisoners. And if you Google image search Guantanamo, this is the kind of image that you'll see. They're either photos that are taken by the military where you can't see the faces of anybody who's in prison there, or they're not photos of the prison at all, but protests and that sort of thing. Actually, this second image here on Google Image Search, like the second hit, is from a movie, like a fictional narrative about Guantanamo. And I think that the effect of this sort of censorship and lack of access is a dehumanization and a stigmatization of the people who are incarcerated there. So we don't see their faces. We're not able to see who they are or what their lives are like. We only see them as prisoners, and prisoners whose faces we can't see. The only photos we have of people who are incarcerated there are basically mugshots that were taken by the military and are released. So this is somebody who was incarcerated there for about 20 years named Abdul Latif Nasser. We don't get to see him like reading a book or with his family or eating food or what he's like as a human outside of the context of prison. Just this is a mugshot of what he looks like in prison. When you think about this from a visual storytelling perspective, like what's the story that we're told in our brains about this person and about other people who are incarcerated there? That story is set and controlled by the government who limits access. So if you know anything about Guantanamo, it's probably this photo that was taken in 2002. And this photo was actually taken by a member of the Navy, was vetted and released by the government. So like, this is an image that the government was okay with the world seeing at that time. And when I look at this, I think, oh, we don't get to know anything about the people who were in prison there. And that's by design. We're supposed to think of them as just like terrorists or people that we can't trust. That was basically my mindset until 2008, when I met this person named Chris Arendt. When I was here in Portland and I was making a zine about just about my life. And Chris happened to be next to me also making a zine. And I was like, what are you working on? What's you making a zine about? And they said, oh, I'm making a zine about my time as a guard at Guantanamo Bay. And I was like, what? That's totally wild. I haven't heard anything like that. So Chris was in the National Guard and wound up serving as a guard at Guantanamo Bay and was really messed up about the experience. After coming back, they joined this group called Iraq Veterans Against the War and started becoming like speaking out against the prison. And they wound up getting invited on a speaking tour with former Guantanamo prisoners. So former guard, former prisoners on a speaking tour around England. And I said, that's the most wild thing I've ever heard about. Can I come on that trip and keep a blog of it? And so I got to travel around England in a minivan with this former guard, Chris, and these former prisoners as they talked through their experiences at Guantanamo Bay, and actually found a lot of common ground where they both felt really exploited by this system and like they had a lack of control over what they were doing. So seeing this common ground that these two people who were on the opposite sides of razor wire were able to find blew my mind. It really changed my ideas of prisons, it changed my ideas of America, and it felt like a story I needed to try and tell. At the time, this was 2008, I made a WordPress blog called Guantanamo Voices. This is my 2008 web design skills, so don't judge too harshly. This was back when like those word clouds were really big, you know, big design trend. So I kept a blog of this trip and always thought I need to make more about this. I need to do a bigger story about this. And the story that I saw was making it into a graphic novel. These are scans from my sketchbook at the time, where I was just documenting experiences we were having on the road trip, on the speaking tour, and then also like interactions with Chris. And I immediately saw this story as being a graphic novel because I think that comics have a really unique power, and that's to make the invisible visible. So the government is trying to keep this prison out of sight, out of mind, but through comics, you can really make a place feel real. So in 2019, I actually got the chance to go to Guantanamo Bay. In this case, I applied to the military as a journalist. They said, okay, you can go for 3 days on this like escorted PR tour of the base and of the prison. Like I said, you're still not allowed to talk to anybody who's incarcerated there, but we'll take you on this PR tour. So I went and I got to take a bunch of photos, though it's still controlled what you can take photos of. They like, the military reviews all your photos and says, you delete these, you can keep these, you can't publish those. So it's still a huge level of censorship. But by taking these photos and being able to turn them into a comic, I can help make this place more visible, literally visible to Americans and to people around the world, and to make it feel real. By taking all these photos of like details of the place, you think of it as a real place full of real people, not just an abstract idea that you see in a headline or a photo you saw once where you can't even see anybody's faces or think about who they are. And so what I'm always trying to do as a journalist is capture these kind of details and convey them to make it feel like it's a real place. Then I took all those photos that I took, all those reference photos, all the interviews I had done with people who had been both imprisoned there and then worked there in different capacities, like as guards or as lawyers. And I wrote up a script for the book. So this script, this is page 1 of the book. It looks just like a movie script. Basically, it's like panel by panel. Here's what the image is. Here's what the text is. The quotes in the book all come from interviews. So they're like direct transcription, and then was fact checked by another journalist. And then I developed this color palette with an artist named Casimir Lee. And with this color palette, I really wanted it to be something that brought readers into this topic. Because Guantanamo is such a depressing and terrible topic, I wanted the colors to help literally illuminate this place that's thought of as so dark, and to help bring people in and say, hey, you can face this. Look, it's in this nice color palette. Like, it's accessible. You know, usually when people have books about Guantanamo, the color palette is like black, orange, razor wire. That's the image you think of. So I wanted to be like, hey, there's more life going on here. It's also inspired by the place, which is, you know, it's on the south side of Cuba, so it's Caribbean. There's beautiful sunsets, lots of like Caribbean colors. I took the script, all these reference photos, etc., handed them over to the artists. So this is the thumbnails of that page, whose script I just showed you, by the artist Hazel Newlevant, also a Portlander. And Hazel took these and did the pencils, colors. And you can see how my photos wound up informing this page. And the other big issue with comics is that they can help get around censorship. So like I said, access to Guantanamo Bay is really tightly controlled. And that's how the government helps maintain its dominant narrative about the place. The person who gets to tell the story is the one who has the most access to the place. But with comics, comics can travel through space and time. You can take what photos you can get, what materials you can get, and then an artist can fill in the gaps to imagine, to show what happened in the past, to show what somebody's feeling. You don't have to have a photo reference or video for every detail. So here's a couple photos I took at the prison. This was not a part that was occupied by people who were incarcerated there, but like an empty part of the prison that they allowed us to go to. And there's a library there of books. So because I wasn't allowed to actually talk to people, what I wanted to do was like, see what are they reading? How can we kind of find their humanity any way that we can and convey that through the book? And then we can use those kind of details and the interviews that they did to have an artist actually draw what it felt like, what the experience was. So this is still from one chapter of the book by a former prisoner named Mansour Dafi. And he's telling the story about something that happened in 2003. These are an animal called banana rats, and they live at the prison. And this is something that we don't have photos of, we don't have videos of. It happened in 2003. There's no way to document it as a more traditional journalist. But because comics can do that thing where they travel through space, they travel through time, they show what people are saying and experiencing, you can show something that happened without having to have a photo reference for it. That's really powerful. In other cases where censorship has not allowed journalists to go in and actually talk to people or photograph what's happening there, you can talk to the people who experience these things and then show what they're talking about, show what they experienced. This is another chapter with a man named Mark Fallon, who worked for NCIS. And he's explaining what it was like when he actually first started working at Guantanamo, being totally outraged about like, who's in prison there? This is a huge mistake. Here's another chapter illustrated by the artist Omar Khoury, showing the experiences of a former prisoner named Mozambique Beg. Like, again, we don't have photos of this kind of thing. We weren't allowed this kind of access, but through talking to him, we can show this story. And I think these pages are really powerful. Omar's style is so gorgeous. So this is that dominant narrative again. Here's what the government's telling us about this place. And one of the key words that they use for that is saying that actually this is not a prison, it's a detention facility. And at Guantanamo, they have all kinds of jargon that's meant to obscure the actual purpose of the place. Anyone who's like older than 20 probably remembers the term enhanced interrogation to refer to torture. There's a bunch of these kind of words that the government uses. And if you're reporting on this place as a traditional reporter, you're like, they put a lot of pressure on you to use this language rather than saying what it actually is. So as a comics journalist, what's cool is I can insert myself in the story to kind of ask the questions that I'm asking in real life. So here's a page from the first chapter of the book where I'm talking to the person who's leading us around on the tour. He's like in charge of PR for the prison at this time. And he's saying, oh, at the detention facility, you can photograph there. And I'm saying, it's not a prison? Why can't we use the word prison? And what term do you use for people who are incarcerated there? Oh, they're detainees. And you can see me, because I can insert myself into the story, you can see me kind of asking those questions. This isn't a situation where I ever come out with like a clear, it's not a strident op-ed that I'm writing about what language you should use. It's more like you can see the journalist in the story asking these kinds of questions. And you can also see, here's the level of censorship that occurs. So, I can show him saying, you can take photographs of this, but not this. And the kind of the hypocrisy with him citing the Geneva Conventions. And I feel like, as a comics journalist, you can just show this happening. You can see the reader experiencing it, and you can make yourself part of the story in this pretty powerful way. It can also show the other details of the place rather than just focusing on the prison itself and having to get down to the nitty gritty of the budget or whatever else people write about Guantanamo right now. It can be like, here's what the place feels like. here's what else I'm seeing here. So this is a photo of the McDonald's. When I was there, there was unironically an escape room happening on the base, organized by the library on base. So I saw this kind of thing and I was like, this is such a wild detail. I have to include this in the comic. There was also a gift shop at Guantanamo Bay. This is a part of the exchange that's on base. Every military base has kind of like a shop where you can buy stuff that's branded with the base. But at Guantanamo, it feels really super surreal and unsettling. Like there's all this Disney branded merchandise. I feel like this is like an especially cursed image. And the cover of the book, which looks like this again, was actually inspired by these postcards I found at the Guantanamo Bay gift shop. So they have all these postcards there that are presenting this really kind of like safe, humane, legal, rosy image of the place. It's beautiful, there's sunsets. So I wanted to take that picture perfect image and then subvert it on the cover by juxtaposing, you know, that kind of beautiful postcard image in the background here with these details showing the really horrific like violence that we've perpetrated there. And this is, the cover was drawn by an artist named Maria Nguyen. And I just think, you know, you can, with comics, you can juxtapose, here's what they're telling us, here's what I'm seeing. And in that way, you can subvert the censorship that's happening. You can help subvert that dominant narrative by showing both yourself being part of the story, asking these questions, and this kind of juxtaposition of like, here's the other details I'm seeing here. I also think what's really powerful about comics is that they capture an emotional reality. They capture the emotion of the situation. And in that way, they really create empathy between the reader and the people who are in the story. So you can see that there's a bunch of ways that artists can create a page that creates an emotion. It's not just about the information that we're conveying. This is not like a Wikipedia article where you like have a bullet list of here's what happened and when. It's an emotional story, and it's meant to capture what people are feeling through colors, through the line work. This is another page by the artist Omar Curry, whose work I showed you before. And he's drawing the story here of Mozambique, who was kidnapped and then sent to Guantanamo. And so I wanted, you know, his line work here feels raw, it feels rough, it feels visceral, it feels kind of violent, and it matches the violence of the story. He took the color palette that I gave all the artists and used only orange and blue, as well as black and white, to kind of create this very surreal feeling here where there's harsh light and a lot of darkness. That has a different emotional feeling than this chapter in the book, which is by the artist Tracy Chawan, about the lawyer Alka Pradhan and her client who's in Guantanamo, where you can see a lot of space on the page to feel what she's feeling. You don't always have to read her mind. You can see it there illustrated. And I think something that's so beautiful about Tracy's work is that it really can capture these strong emotions that are going on. Here's another page from her chapter. And I think this is my second to last point about the power of comics to challenge dominant narratives. It's that they help us connect. So both connect readers to these stories, but then also connect artists to each other. This is a chapter in the book about the person who was in prison there named Abdul Latif Nasser. I interviewed, because I couldn't talk to him, because that's not allowed, I talked to his lawyer, whose name is Shelby Sullivan Bennis. And she told me about letters that Abdul Latif Nasser would write her over his many years in custody. And then I sent her a draft of the book when it was finished, and she sent the book on to Abdul Latif Nasser in Guantanamo. And this is what he looks like again. This is the mugshot taken by the government. This is all I had known about him for. But he wrote this letter back to Shelby. And it's a little bit hard to read, but a section at the bottom here says, regarding the comic book, I think it is a clever attempt from the author to draw attention to our suffering in a funny way. And so for me, this was extremely powerful to read, to feel like, oh, like our government had tried to create this impossible gap between us as Americans and these people who we incarcerated. They wanted us to never think about them, to not be able to communicate with them in any way. And this comic got through, you know, it was able to build a bridge between me as a writer and this person whose life I was writing about. that felt really, really special. And then also, as a side note, he was recently released from Guantanamo. He's the first person released since Trump took office. And he's really happy to be able to get back to his life. He had been cleared of any like wrongdoing for several years now. So like I said, Guantanamo Bay is still open, even though he's released. So the book doesn't have like a happy ending of any kind. It's just an ongoing inquiry, trying to get people to think about and pay attention to this place. And I think that that's the final thing I'll say about the power of comics, is that they really help us face the tough stuff. There's never a good time to talk about Guantanamo. It's not like a happy topic. Here's a page from the book where this lawyer named Thomas Wilner is talking about how he's ruined dinner parties by bringing up what's happening at Guantanamo as he was working on cases of people who were incarcerated there. And that's how I feel too. It's really a difficult part of our history and our present to face. And as Americans, I think it's something we have a responsibility to face. And so I think that comics can help us grapple with that, with what we've done. I think that comics can help us face this history. There are a dozen big books written about Guantanamo, but I want this one to feel accessible. I want it to feel like one you can pick up and actually read and think about what we've done, and challenge that narrative that the government has sold us. And I think that comics, whether you're writing about something extremely important and big like Guantanamo, or just about yourself, can help you face those difficult things. So a lot of my comics are not about those kind of topics. They're just about me and what I'm experiencing. This is the comic that I made about, you know, what I'm thinking about gender during the pandemic. And that combination of just sort of writing from the heart and combining words and pictures has power no matter what it is I think you're writing about, whether it's about yourself and your life and your community and your friends, or those really big, important, you know, more global and political topics. I think that it has power. And I also think that it has like a political angle. So I'll say, like, what stories do you want to share? And just as importantly, what stories do you want to challenge? And I think that comics can be a really good medium for doing both of those. I think that whenever you create a nonfiction comic, you're adding your voice out there to the conversation that's happening, and you're sharing something that's important to you. And in that way, you're creating your own narrative and sharing that with the world in a way that can challenge those big stories that we're told about who we are and what's happening in the world.